second time, and I call the honourable member for Gilmore.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I sit in this room and listen to some of the comments that are being made about changing the media laws, and it's referenced back to the Howard years, and then it's referenced to this government, and somehow or other there was a missing 6 years in there where nothing happened, and that was nothing to do with the coalition. So I kind of wonder what what divided and what went invisible at that stage. And then there's already a concentration of media without considering, would you believe the population numbers? We only have 24 million people in this nation. You cannot have 150 media suppliers when you only have 24 million people. It simply isn't economic. And naturally that's an economic consideration, and that very often is missing when it comes from the other side. But going back to this actual ledge, why the heck would the government mess around with media legislation if it wasn't in the best interests of the general population? Because it's those people who are going to vote for us afterwards. Especially when, in my view, the media often acts as the unelected fourth level of government. When the bill was first floated, all my local media reps, whether they were my stringers, whether they were the managers, whether they were interviewers, they asked me to stand up on their behalf because they believe this is great change. We talked at length at how this was absolutely critical to maintaining regional news. And as a regional MP, that sort of news is essential for my community to hear what I have to say for them. And then they can have their say back to me, which is always a good thing as well. As I know that many in Gilmore are not yet using the internet or Facebook for their news, then the TV is still our primary provider of news. It has done an amazing job over many decades, and I have a great deal of respect for most members of our media. I find them to be fair about issues for the most part, not always on my side, but at least giving me a chance to have my say and put the alternate point of view forward. Don't always like the clips they show, but that's okay, that's the way it is. I support the legislation as it will retain many regional jobs and will still get great regional news. There's been three parts to this change, and it's about proposing a market aggregation. And this has been a happening process since the 1980s. Gradual change here, gradual change there. This is not actually a new concept. It's been going on for a very, very long time. A lot of the legislative framework is already there, but that was determined a long, long time ago, kind of sort of about the time when I was about 5, and this great big box came into the lounge room, was about 6 foot by 4 foot by this much. And it was Easter time, and it was the first TV we ever had. I played with the box, wasn't really interested in the TV because I was only little. But you know, this legislation's been around for a very long time. It's time to tweak it, time to fix it, time to sort it. And indeed, later on, when there's different technology, it will need to be tweaked and changed again. But having only 3 media platforms, newspapers, TV and radio, it was kind of sort of appropriate. But for smartphones and social media and streaming services, it absolutely isn't. It's totally unfair. So including the 75% audience reach rule, which did prohibit a person, either in their own right, a director or one or more companies, from controlling commercial television broadcasting licences, it actually caused grief to my area, because it meant that those other services were supplying the news and the items and the articles for many of my people who couldn't get it. I think this is a grand idea of changing it. And in the digital media environment, this rule is actually redundant. Digital media can reach anywhere, wherever you've got a phone or wherever you've got reception for it, or if you're connected to the internet. You can get anything from anywhere. There's no limits. Viewers can already receive heaps of video and audio media services, and even the streamed versions of the metropolitan commercial television services. I'm not much interested in what's going on in Metro News, but sometimes I actually need to know what's going on up in the cities as well. Much more interested in what's going on in my area. 2 of the 3 Metro commercial stations already provide streamed versions going across Australia, so we've already got quite a coverage going on. Viewers in regional areas already receive the same number of commercial television services and substantially the same commercial television programming, including news, as their Metro counterparts. I'd much prefer to have our regions retained. Any merger between metro and regional commercial TV broadcasters, should this occur, would generally involve the replacement of one of the television voice with another, due to the fact that metro and regional networks generally operate in separate licence areas. Media transactions would still be subject to general competition laws, and the government will ask the ACCC to update their media merger guidance accordingly. Together, the repeal of the 75% audience reach rule and 2 out of 3 rule will reduce the regulatory burden on the media industry, allow the media businesses to operate more flexibly in the market, and help ensure they can continue to provide high-quality news and entertainment service to Australians. The 2 out of 3 rule restricts traditional media companies from optimising the scale and scope of their operations and from accessing resources, capital and management expertise in other sectors, which of course any business needs to be able to access, especially these days when things are expanding so much. You need to be able to tap into other areas to get all sorts of help in many different ways. At the same time, other unregulated platforms, and that's like the YouTube and the Facebook, they're free to consolidate and adapt their businesses as much as they like, subject to wider considerations like competition rules. From a consumer perspective, online media is no longer viewed as something distinct from the more traditional media platforms, and audiences in Australia and overseas now use multiple sources, lots of news organisations and multiple media platforms, online, social media, television, radio and newspapers to discover and access news. I know for one that most of my family, my young kids, they access their news on Facebook. Heaven forbid, I'm a bit worried about that. I would hope they go to some more reliable sources as well. Changes to this rule would only have a material impact on the capital city markets in Darwin and Hobart. Most of the other places are generally going to be in advance of that. In most regional and remote markets, the removal of the 2 out of 3 rule will have minimal impact. In 62 of the 99 regional and remote radio licence areas in Australia, which is 63%, the current media outlets do not include operations from all 3 regulated platforms: commercial television, commercial radio and associated newspapers. The removal of the rule would therefore have no bearing on cross-media ownership in these markets. In 10 of the remaining 37 licence areas, further media consolidation of any sort will be prohibited because they are all at or below the diversity floor of a minimum of 4 voices under the 5x4 rule. Only in 27 of the 99 regional and remote radio licence areas, which is just 27% or just over, could any acquisition or merger activity take place as a result of the repeal of the 2 out of 3. So it's basically just under a third. Media transaction would still be subject to the ACCC. Together with these 2 different changes will help ensure that these businesses can continue to provide high-quality news to all of us. I think the last one, establishing new local content obligations, is probably the most critical for any regional MP. This measure is needed to make sure that the regional Australians, such as all my people in Gilmore, can actually have access to the local content and local news that they value. They're a bit like me. They're not that keen on news from Sydney. They want to know what's happening in their local area, particularly as the summer is coming and there's bushfires coming and they need updates and warnings, and it has to be local. So the new obligations will apply to regional commercial television broadcasters subject to what's called a trigger event. That is where, as a result of a change in control, they become part of a group of commercial broadcasting licences whose combined licence area population exceeds 75% of the Australian population. These new obligations will apply to licensees as a trade-off for the opportunity to use new possibilities and improve the efficiency of their operations. The bill specifies a minimum amount of local content which licensees must broadcast each week to applicable local content areas, depending on the type of licence area and whether a trigger event has occurred. Points are pretty hard to get, so it's pretty important. Where there is no trigger event, licensees in aggregated markets must continue to meet the 720-point requirement over a 6-week period. So the public can rest assured that there is still going to be an enormous amount of local content, especially when you look at how many points they can actually achieve by putting in certain content. So they get 3 points, just 3 points for broadcasting eligible during the eligible periods, which when more people are looking at it instead of the 2 to 4 o'clock in the morning period, or broadcasting something that hasn't been previously broadcast, they get 3 points. And if it's absolutely local content, they get 3 points. And if it's local news, it's 3 points. But if it's only just a little line item in the news, it's just 2 points. And if it's any other material for a regional area, it's just 2 points. So 720 points is a lot to get for a regional TV station to get, so we can rest assured that we are going to get our local content. Licensees in non-aggregated markets will not be subject to any local programming obligations, which seems pretty fair to me. Where a trigger event has occurred, affected licensees in aggregated markets must meet a higher 900-point requirement over a 6-week period. Affected licensees in most non-aggregated markets must then meet a 360-point requirement over a 6-week period. These will absolutely ensure that local programming is nearly all regional licence areas following a trigger event, including where there is none currently. So that means if they're walloping in a whole stack of other stuff that's got nothing to do with the local region, at the moment they don't have to. It suits them better though, they get better advertising revenue. They will also introduce an incentive for local news content to be filmed in the local area, which will be built into the new point system. And I have to tell you, as a regional MP, I really appreciate that, because them running a bit of film from some other area and then having my voice over a news item actually doesn't work particularly well for my people. Licensees will be required to submit 2 annual reports on their compliance with new obligations, commencing 18 months after the trigger event. So there is actually going to be some follow-up to make sure they're doing the right thing. Additionally, the Australian Communications and Media Authority will be required to undertake a review of the effectiveness of new local programming obligations 2 years after their commencement. This is quite an amazing change, and the reviewers, the managers, we just feel that it's such a great thing for our local region. I need to have local news stories. When I put out an idea that I'm going to have a forum for youth in my area, I use the local paper, I use the local radio stations, and that's how I get the message out. Sometimes I do paid advertising on there, but sometimes it's on news. If there's a special event like funding for a Jindalara, which is going to have accommodation for children with disability, or we've got a birthing facility in Ulladulla, my local people need to see that local news. Or if it's Yumaro, who are getting some funding for their disability structures, or if it's for my local cadets who've been given a grant, or the Writing for Disabled who are getting a grant. All of those stories need to be held by my local media, and they usually like to be involved in it because they personally like to run local stories. My stringer, Michael, has a favourite project which we've managed to get $300,000 for. Part of the river wash, every time the Shoalhaven River floods at a particular bend, there's loss of about a metre and a half, and it's a favourite project of Michael's because he keeps saying, when are we going to get this done? When are we going to get this done? Because if it keeps having a storm event every 6 months, which has been current, then that river is going to wash out part of the sand track, which is what we commonly call it where we live, and that will cut off our alternate south coast route to get down to the holidays. So we're concerned about that. So the community learned about the $300,000 commitment from the government to fix that breach in the river, and we can manage that, and eventually then we'll get a Green Army in there to plant, and it will be absolutely fabulous. I'm so proud that that's happening. I couldn't get those messages out to the community without my local media. I think they do a phenomenal job, and we need to support them in every possible way that we can, and this legislation is exactly that. We will retain our media content local, and our local people will be very, very happy to see the reports on the news of storm events, shark sightings when we have to get new shark nets out, for bushfires, even for car accidents that are blocking off the highway, so that if you intended to travel, you're tuned into your local radio, or you're tuned into your local TV at home, ring your family, say, don't bother coming down the coast for a couple of hours, it's blocked. okay? Or a couple of years ago when there were fires at Jerrawangla and the highway was cut, people would say, well, don't bother coming from Milton up, you can't get there, and don't bother trying to get south. So thanks to the local media.
I thank the honourable